Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our Smarter series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. So let me just set the stage for where we are at this current time, because everything's moving so quickly. It's just a few days before Christmas 2021. And it has certainly been a historic year. We're still in the throes of this global pandemic. We've seen a political transition in the United States. I started to try to list all the different stories that we've covered on Smarter News and Beyond. How do you choose? There are just so many of them. And that's why I think history, a dash of history, is so important to any news cycle, because it's the salt on the table. It just brings out the flavor of what we're talking about. And you just need that little dash now and then for something that's very difficult to describe, and that is perspective. We all need perspective now and then. So there was an interview I did a couple years ago that I re-listened to just last night with a remarkable historian that was so generous to me when I was just starting out Smarter News. And I sat down with him at Washington Crossing State Park to talk about what has been described as a pivotal moment in the American Revolution, really in the beginning of this nation. And if you need perspective at the end of the year, this is the story to listen to. And Craighead is the historian to listen to as well, because he has been telling this story in a variety of different ways, Clay, for the better part, more than 30 years now. So first of all, thank you for your generosity to me in 2018 when we first met, when I came to the state park to hear the story of Washington's Crossing. And as I recall, my equipment wasn't working. You were very patient with me, and it was a great conversation. But now
it was.
It was I really appreciated it. And, I wanted to actually, I thought, well, maybe I could just replay it. It was such a good conversation. Maybe I could just replay it. But I thought, I'm going to reach out to Clay, see if he's around. Maybe he could talk to us one more time, because even in the course of this last couple of years, Clay, I'm just curious if maybe even your perspective on this point of history has changed. Why don't let's just jump in though. What was Christmas like in 1776 leading up to Washington's Crossing?
I find myself talking a lot about the prelude because, again, I don't think many people do know that. And it sets the scene for the dramatic turnaround, the victory, the crossing and the victories at Trenton. When the country declared its independence, that's all it was a declaration. And the British were in the process of shipping an army over. And it just happened that within days after the declaration, the British landed their army on Staten Island. Their objective was New York City. Washington was preparing to defend New York. And in a series of battles, he suffered a series of, pretty much devastating defeats. British beat Washington at the Battle of Long Island in August, Battle of Harlem Heights, White Plains. Fort Washington was captured. 3,000 Americans surrendered at the fort, probably one of the biggest disasters of the Revolution. And again, the British captured New York, and then they chased Washington through New Jersey. Washington fell back through the state. Having lost New York, he was then going to try and protect Philadelphia, the American capital. And the British, really was only preparing to capture New York for that campaign season. But momentum carried them into New Jersey. They had been so successful with defeating Washington. And so they pursued Washington through New Jersey in late November and early December. Washington fell back. He was hoping the New Jersey militia, the Pennsylvania militia, these are the short-term military organizations, would come out and strengthen his army. But they were so demoralized due to the defeats in New York that they were coming out in very few numbers and not very enthusiastically. So Washington had no choice but to continue to retreat. And then in a desperate move to protect Philadelphia, he sent men ahead to start confiscating the boats along the Delaware, so his army could then escape across the river and then hide the boats on the Pennsylvania side. So when the British reached the river, they wouldn't be able to cross. And that's exactly what happened. The British pursued them to the river. Washington escapes across the Delaware on the night of December 7th at Trenton. And it takes so long to get the army across, it's well into the afternoon of December 8th. And that's when the British arrived. But in the coming days, the British looked for boats and couldn't find any. So the gathering of the boats stopped the British advance, protected Philadelphia. And then the British would go into winter quarters. They rarely fought in the wintertime. And not finding boats to cross the river, they became a little complacent. They could have built boats, and General Howe would later be criticized for not taking that extra step. But they're so overconfident, having won all the battles up until this point, I suggest they come complacent, and then they spread their army out throughout New Jersey and go back to New York for the winter, which then gives Washington the opportunity to use the boats he had gathered to cross Christmas night and attack one of their outposts where the Hessians are stationed in Trenton. And then he finally wins a battle.
So, wow. So the British are on a roll. Yeah, right. The British are on a roll. And by the way, it was a violent conflict. I mean, we think about the American Revolution, there's a way of looking back on it without some of that detail. And we don't need to get into a bunch of gory detail, Clay, but they killed, people were dying for the independence of America. And the British were basically kind of running through the early Americans.
Yeah, running roughshod in a sense. And, the British perspective was that we were traitors. We were rebelling against our king. So, the treatment of American prisoners early on is very poor. They don't really treat them as combatants almost. A lot of the guys captured in Fort Washington are put on prison ships in Walbaut Bay in New York Harbor and treated very inhumanely. And it's estimated, I think, nearly half of the guys die in imprisonment. But early on, it's really, I'll say, barbaric. It's pretty inhumane treatment. So
as the British are moving and they were moving into the winter on the East Coast, as you mentioned, unlike current times, although there can be seasons in war, there was sort of a pause for winter. And General Washington has a lot of challenges, not just the weather, it's also morale, right? And trying to figure out how to get a group of people that were willing to die for a new country to stay with him, right, Clay? Because there were some timelines that he was working with.
The morale has suffered. It's a volunteer army. He knows he needs something positive. He's not ready to go into winter quarters, because if he does, with a series of defeats that he suffered in New York, and with not a positive thing to encourage recruitment, it's going to be a real hard sell. He's going to have a tough time. And on top of that, the soldiers that are in the army, nearly half of the soldiers' enlistments are about ready to expire at the end of the year. So he's going to lose these guys. And the word he's getting from his officers, few of these guys plan on re-enlisting. They had served their time. They haven't deserted, so nothing against them. They had volunteered. So when their terms are up, they're certainly free to go. But Washington's desperate to keep them together, to hang on to them. And he knows he needs a victory, something positive to go into the winter with, so he can raise and recruit a new army. And that's where, the crossing will come about, and the victory at Trenton, which is so desperately needed for that intangible morale effect.
What about supplies, resources? What did this young army look like for General Washington?
They're not starving. You hear about some of the winter encampments, which the winter encampments are all bad. Trying logistically keep an army fed when the roads are muddy, snowy, icy, it's challenging. So the winters at Valley Forge and Morristown, the army suffers. But the guys are not starving. They're probably a bit malnourished. They're not getting 3 square meals. So it is a challenge to keep these guys fed. The order of Christmas night is for the soldiers to carry 40 rounds of ammunition, 3 days cooked rations. So that's probably some type of hard bread, hardtack, and a good blanket. That was really basically the order for the soldiers, and besides their cartridge box and musket, of course. The guys, what they go through on Christmas night and the march to Trenton and then the march back, they really suffer. Again, Of the 2,400 men, that takes 10 hours to cross the river in a snowstorm. They then have a 9-mile march in that same snowstorm. They fight and win the battle, capture 900 Hessians, and then they march another 9 miles back with their prisoners to the river and then cross the river again. So you add it up, it's well over 20 miles, crossing the river twice in awful weather. And some of these guys not fully clothed or shod. Some of these guys don't have proper shoes. There's an account that you could follow the bloody footprints in the snow from the soldiers who didn't have shoes, or who are tying their worn out shoes together and trying to keep them together. Hopefully that's a minority of the guys. It wouldn't take too many to make the bloody snow, but we don't really know. But the condition of the army is not great. When uniforms and shoes are wearing out, there's not enough money to keep these guys resupplied. So these guys are making do with the best they can on their own in some cases.
It's not easy. And they're not using all weather gear like we have, right? They're
absolutely not. That's right.
Right. Heavy wool. So we're moving into Christmas Day, and you gave us a great synopsis. So we're moving into this plan by General Washington, which I'm going to let you describe. But okay, we have to remember the momentum's with the British. The British went into winter quarters. This is when they're going to take a little bit of a break. General Washington says we can't take a break. I'm going to lose what little energy I have for this cause. That's we right. had all of this enthusiasm for independence, and now it looks like we're not going to make it. And did General Washington what did he believe at the time, Clay, about what was possible?
Well, it's interesting. And again, when you summarize this, just kind of gloss over when Washington escaped across the Delaware.
And he's running away. He's running away right. from the British.
That's right. And then he's going to try and stop them at the river. But interestingly, he writes to Congress in Philadelphia. And he doesn't paint a pretty picture. He basically states bluntly what's going on. And he says he's been lucky enough to secure the boats, and only the Delaware has stopped the British. His army hasn't stopped. It's the Delaware. And had it been summertime, it could have been a different story. But it's winter, so the Delaware River in winter stops the British advance. But he writes to Congress to explain this, and he says basically if the British find boats, which, how confident can you be you've gathered all the boats, and it was a 70-mile stretch of river that they were confiscating all the boats, or if the British build boats, my army's not going to be able to stop them. That's what he basically tells Congress. So, and I love to point this out because this shows how bad things are. What does Congress do? They adjourn to Baltimore. So they flee Philadelphia because the fear is the British are going to cross, capture Philadelphia, and the government's running for their lives. So that's how bad.
And they could actually be. I mean, correct me, Clay. You would know. I mean, they could be executed, right? Because they're traitors.
Yeah, we don't know. Franklin, early on, basically, commented, we might as well hang together or certainly hang separately. It's kind of what he phrased, when things are tough, we got to stick together. Whether that would have been the case, I don't know. So Congress flees, and the population is right behind on their heels. So everybody's fearing. So they're packing up their valuables and fleeing. Washington, in mid-December, at about this time, writes to a relative, and he doesn't publicly state this, but we see his letters now. But he wrote to a relative, "I fear the game's pretty near the up." So in his mind, the lack of support he's getting, the militia not coming out, and at one point he says, instead of coming out to support our army, the citizens are making their submissions as fast as they can. And this is due to actually the British, when they advanced through New Jersey, they offered a pardon to New Jersey citizens if they swore allegiance to the King of England. Their past rebellious deeds would be forgiven. And backed by British victories, this is having quite an effect.
That sets the stage. We have families that are looking at each other thinking we were going to be part of this great new independent nation, but now maybe we made the wrong decision. We have the kind of the stage set for General Washington. He's understanding the stakes. He's understanding what he's facing. And he decides to put together this mission to hopefully take the other side by surprise. And he has a plan, but part of the plan, Clay, maybe didn't include the weather.
Absolutely
because
not.
it
Yes,
starts to
right.
snow. So this is
Right.
just to give the idea of insult on injury. You're think of what General Washington was going through, and he has this plan, and you can't control the weather, and the
Right.
weather is its own force. So take it from there,
Absolutely.
Clay. What are we looking at on Christmas Day?
Well, the plan and the British, when the British went into winter quarters, they left about 1,400 Hessians in Trenton. And there's a
And
post
can I
south. Go ahead.
can I stop you there for a second? Because oftentimes we talk about the Hessians and we don't exactly explain. These are basically a hired militia that the British
Yeah,
have contracted.
it's more complicated. And again, I kind of refer to it as another fascinating sidebar story, but needs to be explained. The Hessians are German soldiers. They're being rented by the British, and they're kind of mislabeled as Hessians. Some of them are actually Hessians from Hesse-Hanau and Hesse-Kassel in a not yet united Germany. Germany's broken up into a bunch of small principalities, and there are six German princes that will rent their troops to the British. So where's the money going? It's going to the prince, not to the soldier. And when you mention mercenary, I think the logical conclusion everybody jumps to is that these are volunteer, well-paid soldiers. Well, they didn't volunteer to fight in this war, and they're not that well paid. So that mercenary term kind of misleads. But the British have a manpower shortage. Their empire, is spread out around the globe, and there's not a whole lot of enthusiasm in recruitment in England, to get British citizens to come over and kill British colonists. There's not a whole lot of enthusiasm for that. So they have to reach out for the mercenaries, and the German princes, make a profit off of raising, large standing armies. And then when there's wars, they rent out their troops. The morale of these guys, they perform very well, but push comes to shove. Are they going to fight to the last? Probably not. They perform at Trenton adequately. They're just, the odds are stacked against them, when they're surrounded. But Washington plans to cross the river here Christmas night. He's going to cross at Washington Crossing State Park, what is now Washington Crossing State Park, with this striking force, about 2,400 men. But there's two other crossings that are supposed to take downriver. General Ewing is going to cross just below Trenton to cut off the escape route south. And then at Bristol, another body of American troops are supposed to cross to keep that other enemy post south of Trenton busy so they won't reinforce Trenton. But the ice conditions in the river are so bad, those two units south do not cross. So Washington has an easier time. Now, having said that, it takes 10 hours, 4 hours longer than Washington had planned for it to take. He was hoping to have everybody across by midnight, but another unplanned event was the nor'easter that kicked in during the night, which made for a very miserable night for the soldiers, and then just slowed everything down. So it takes much longer to get the army across. The interesting thing about the weather, though, again, made it miserable for the soldiers and slowed everything, it does lull the enemy to some extent. The Hessians in Trenton, they would send patrols out to the ferry landing. So on December 24th, for instance, a patrol comes all the way up to what is now Washington Crossing, Johnson's Ferry. So it's a 9-mile hike for these Hessians up and back. And as I like to kind of make light of, it's on December 24th, a day too soon or too early to be of any real use for the Hessians, though they're trying to be vigilant with these patrols. But on Christmas night or on the morning of December 26th, when the army's marching down, the snowstorm affects their patrols, where one is canceled because of the severity of the storm. This is on the Hessian side, and one is shortened. So the snowstorm kind of helps with what is going to be a surprise, though they're not celebrating Christmas, drinking and partying. They're not hungover and totally surprised. It's just that they're not prepared for the vigorous attack that is coming.
What do you make of General Washington going on the offensive, considering everything that he's thinking about, then plus the weather? For some other person, they might say, you know what? Let's delay. This is actually not worth it. I'm going to just let's just wait. Let's just give it a week.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? That the fact that he was still willing to go on the offense when there were so many things stacked against him.
After the fact, when he wrote about it, he said that he, labored over the decision whether to cancel the whole operation. He did consider it, but then when he thought about it to bring the men that had already been across back over, he was concerned, and it would take some time, concerned that he may be discovered while this was happening, and then take a defeat or be very vulnerable, spread out between Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And also just the whole, he knew they were desperate for a victory. They really needed to do something. The die was cast when it began, and he was reluctant to cancel it. And even with the snowstorm, he pushed on at all costs, which turned out to be certainly the right decision.
So there's a famous painting of him standing at the front of a boat, what looks like a rowboat of some sort. He has this amazing look on his face.
Yes.
Forging across this river. What do you make of that portrayal compared to what actually happened? Any
painting is an artistic interpretation, and they have artistic license. And Emanuel Leutze painting that, it's the iconic image that everybody throughout the world, frankly, it's a world famous painting. But the artist's intent wasn't really historically accurate. I mean, he could have crossed the net, but he probably wouldn't wanted to stand in it.
Right. Especially considering, and now that I lived on the East Coast for a little bit, Clay, too, a nor'easter is formidable. You don't even want to walk down the street sometimes, let alone maybe stand up in a boat. And so it's important to remember those conditions. So tell me, so they get across. So what happens at Christmas going into the 26th that is so critical to the American Revolution?
Yeah, well, as I said, for that intangible morale effect, they are desperate for victory. Most of the Army believes, this is the crisis moment. We need a victory. And of course, Thomas Paine's crisis papers come out days prior to this as well to try and bolster that morale. These are the times to try men's souls, the summer soldier and sunshine patriot, wilderness crisis, shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves love and thanks of man and woman. And that's all the part I have memorized, but it goes on. But they're just trying to bolster that sagging morale. So Washington's going to plan for the attack on Trenton. It takes all night into the morning, and then they have a 9-mile march in the snowstorm, which takes up another 4 hours. So they don't get down to Trenton until after sunrise. Again, Washington's concerned he's going to lose the element of surprise. He was hoping to get down there before sunrise, but because of the nor'easter and everything being slowed up, it's not till about 8 in the morning. But as I said, the Hessian patrols, one is canceled, one is shortened. It's still snowing. One of the accounts for one of the Hessian pickets outside of town, these are the guard posts outside of town, mentions that he sees the Americans advancing through the snowstorm. And his 20 or 30 men turned out and fired upon him. So they saw him coming. This is the first warning line of defense. They fired upon the advancing Americans, but they were overwhelmed. They were being outflanked, outnumbered, and they had to retreat into town. So the first line of defense buys minutes warning. The main Hessian garrison in town only has a few minutes warning of the attack. Interestingly enough, there's 3 Hessian regiments in Trenton. One regiment has orders, this is about 400 men, has orders to sleep in uniform to be ready at a moment's notice. So again, the idea that they were drinking, partying, which is one of the big myths in American history, that we caught the Hessians napping or hungover, is a myth. The Hessians, if anything, were worn out and fatigued from the constant harassment that was going on for about a week and a half prior to Christmas. Raiding parties were coming across the river and beating up the Hessian patrols and guard posts. To the extent that one Hessian who wrote a diary said, or wrote, "We have not slept one night in peace since coming to this place."
So not every colonist was willing to kind of sign over to the British. That there sounds like there were those that were harassing.
Yeah, and some in Washington's army were crossing. The New Jersey militia was getting motivated as time went on because they were being now occupied by a foreign power, and treatment during the occupation wasn't, stellar. There's some atrocities that take place, pillage and so forth, pillaging land and property, and assaults on the population. To the extent that the Americans make a big example of it. They use this as a kind of a propaganda in some of these cases to try and spread the word that these guys are causing trouble and we should resist them. And so the New Jersey militia is starting to do a little bit more than what they were doing. So they're beating up some of the Hessian guard posts as well.
So how did Washington win?
Yeah, well, so he during the march, he divides his army into two columns. So they take two separate roads down to Trenton to hit either end of the town almost simultaneously. And then they quickly surround the town. The Hessians don't know what they're up against right away. So they do put up a fight. They're chased out of the town. They counterattack to try and retake the town. And then they start to get an idea of what's going on. And at that point, it's too late. They are surrounded. And the snowstorm, which affects the weapons at the time, the flintlock muskets, when they become wet, you can't get sparks to ignite wet gunpowder. So as the battle progresses, fewer and fewer muskets on both sides can't be fired. Washington brought 18 cannon across the river. The Hessians have 6. So Washington has an advantage in artillery. He uses them very effectively. They're brought up very quickly. And the Hessians are surrounded, outnumbered. The American artillery is firing cannonballs down the streets, and there's no escape. So the battle, you get various estimates of how long the battle lasts. My best, ballpark is from first shot to last, maybe an hour. It could have been a little longer, could have been a little less. But it's a brief battle. Casualties are low because of the weather. Over 900 Hessians are captured, a few hundred escape, but I think 22 are killed, 70 or 80 wounded. On the American side, depending on which account you read, and it varied, Washington, even in a couple letters, states different things. But at one point, he mentions 1 or 2 killed, but then he sums it up, our losses were very trifling. So 1 or 2 killed, a handful wounded. Our school kids, I always ask them, what do they think happened after the Army won the battle? Well, celebrate. Well, yeah, they probably celebrated for 30 minutes or so, right? They had a brief celebration, and then they had a 9-mile march back. And according to one of the soldiers, it turned into a torrential downpour. So it warmed up a little, and now it's a heavy rain, which doesn't sound much better than if it was snowing, frankly. So now they're completely drenched. And some of the guys don't make it back. This is another part of the untold story. The casualties are low in the battle, but there's a one New Jersey homeowner's account who wrote a diary, and he wrote that he took in a number of sick soldiers after the Battle of Trenton who were marching back to the river and just couldn't make it back. And there's another account from a soldier who says he went into a home, he was welcomed into a home, he warmed up, and then went back and made it back to the river. But of the soldiers who didn't make it back, the homeowner said 1 or 2 died during the night as well. So how many of these guys do not recover is a question I don't hazard a guess at. I'd be hard pressed. Of the 2,400 men, there is some account that 1,000 of them are unfit for duty the next day. So, the exposure, the exertion, has made some of these guys sick, and they may have recovered very quickly, some of them, but some of them certainly do not. Probably make it into the hospitals, and some of them die. I'm certain of, but we don't know the exact.
Wow, it gives you a lot of perspective on the willpower that they had going into this battle, and then trying to make it back to where they could kind of gather themselves. A couple of years ago, you said the more time that's passed. And you've obviously spent a lot of time on this topic, but the more time that has passed, you have even more greater appreciation for why this single battle may be the most important battle that we know about in the American Revolution. Tell us why. Why does it matter so much, Clay?
It's viewed as a turning point, but it's really the game saver. I really truly believe that. And I think that has, that realization on my part has evolved over the years. Without these victories, it looked like it was about ready to end. The British felt that way. Many Americans were getting to feel that way. So, I'll throw Battle of Princeton in there as well. The 10-day campaign, Christmas crossing, the Battle of Trenton on December 26th. There's a second Battle of Trenton on January 2nd, and then the Battle of Princeton on January 3rd. So we don't have enough time to talk in detail about those battles as well. But to sum up the 10-day campaign, there's 3 battles, essentially 3 victories that really revitalize the will to persevere and continue to fight. And nobody knows how long the war is going to last, and it goes on till 1783, till a peace treaty is signed. So it's a long war. This is very early in the war. The British opportunity, I think, to really kind of wrap this up is lost here. It looked like it was about ready to be won. The British felt it was, and it's easy to, with hindsight, and to say what happened, but I do believe had things not been won here, it could have been the end, the support just wouldn't have been there. But that is speculation, which we, as a historian, we try not to do much of, but it sometimes is fun to do.
Well, I like to say these are the moments where you introduce something to consider to the audience. It's something to consider. It may not be an absolute, but it's something to consider that if there was not victory, Christmas and the day after Christmas, 1776, America may not have existed the way that it has. And although we're also in challenging times now, it's important to remember, General Washington didn't know he was going to become President Washington. Those men didn't know that the war was going to last another 7, 8 years from that point. Right. They didn't know that they were going to win. We're looking back on it like they're winners. They didn't know, and I think there's such interesting lessons to be learned. And I'm not sure exactly, everyone can take their own interpretation of that. But I'm curious, as a final question for you, Clay, considering everything that we've been through, I mean, we've lived through a lot of history over the last several decades, but particularly over the last 2 years. When you think of the perseverance of General Washington and those men on that night that decided to do something incredible, bloody footprints in the snow and all, what do you think is the lesson?
The soldiers had been on the defensive and losing, right? When the orders come to cross the river on Christmas night, and I think they know something special is going on. They're finally on the offensive. Again, when they were on the defensive and losing, they were suffering. Now it's payback time, right? They're going to go on a surprise maneuver, cross the river, attack the enemy, and try and get something positive going. And the struggle, and the sacrifices that they make to do that is pretty amazing. It's really almost an epic feat of accomplishment to cross the river in a snowstorm, march 9 miles, fight the battle, march 9 miles back. And I mean, it's really, and I like to joke sometimes with our visitors, you'd be hard pressed to fabricate a dramatic story like the crossing of the Battle of Trenton. You'd be hard pressed. And this actually happened, right?
You're like, but this is real. It really happened. What is it? I mean, people use this term, but I can't help it. I mean, we are in the holidays. So is it a Christmas miracle, Clay? Is it?
Yes, I believe it is. It's viewed by the population at the time, certainly, as almost a miracle turn of events. Yes, many were preparing to cash it in, right? It was almost over. And then it's an incredible dramatic turnaround, from defeat and despair. There's now hope and more confidence in the future. And that's really the impact that the crossing and the victory at Trenton really will have, is to revitalize and keep things alive. The war is not won here, certainly, but as I think I said earlier, it's saved. It's saved from a potential quick defeat.
Well, maybe the lesson here is, even in tough times, keep going. Even when you can't see clearly, you're blinded by snow. Keep going, keep moving, and don't give up, and believe in something. Well, Clay, I appreciate your time. I've taken on enough of it. Now twice in
That's all right.
2018, 2021. But I appreciate it. I appreciate being able to take a moment to remember this and not
Yes.
forget it. And it's a Christmas story that maybe we can, squeeze into The Grinch and Home Alone and The Night Before Christmas, the
Right.
story of Washington Crossing, and to remember that moment that happened. Maybe the real Christmas miracle of 1776. So, Clay, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for everything.
My pleasure.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.